Have you ever found yourself giving so much to your family that you start to lose sight of who you are? Have you ever wondered if there's a way to love those closest to you without losing yourself? If you've ever felt torn between family responsibilities and your happiness, you're not alone, and this video is for you. Today, we're diving into the inspiring story of Mrs. Rosa, a grandmother who, like many of us, thought that dedicating her entire life to her family was the only way to show love. But what happens when caring for others means sacrificing your dreams? In this video, you'll discover how Mrs. Rosa transformed her life by reclaiming her independence, and how that courageous decision not only brought her happiness, but strengthened her relationship with her family. Stay with us until the end because Mrs. Rosa's journey is filled with powerful lessons about love, freedom, and the delicate balance between family and personal fulfillment. Along the way, you'll learn how to apply these lessons to your life, whether it's rediscovering a passion you put aside, setting healthy boundaries with loved ones, or simply finding time for yourself again. By the end of this video, you'll see how an act of self-love can ripple through your entire family, changing lives for the better. So, if you've ever felt that your personal needs are being overshadowed by family obligations, this story will inspire you to make a change. Remember, it's never too late to start living life on your terms. Ready to learn how? Let's get started. This intro hits the audience's psychology by addressing a relatable struggle, feeling lost in family obligations, and promises to provide both inspiration and practical advice, keeping viewers engaged until the very end. If you are not subscribed, I recommend subscribing and activating the notification bell so you don't miss any videos. Your support means a lot to me. And if you enjoyed this video, you can help me continue spreading the valuable lessons by liking and sharing it. The mornings seemed to drift by like a warm breeze, filled with the smell of French toast and the soft giggles of her grandchildren. Rosa would sit with them at the breakfast table, crafting imaginative stories that brought life to their mealtime. Those moments were precious, and in the afternoons, she found herself reliving her past as a teacher, helping the little ones with their homework. Each time little Matto turned to her with his sweet voice asking, "Grandma, can you help me with math?" her heart would swell with love and warmth. It was in these small, tender moments that Rosa felt her purpose. Every request for help, every "thank you, Grandma," made her feel as though she had tapped into a wellspring of vitality, as if the years were falling away and she had rediscovered a version of herself long forgotten. A study from Stanford University confirmed what Rosa was living. Intergenerational cohabitation could bring immense joy and a sense of meaning to the lives of grandparents. For Rosa, these daily moments felt like magic, like she had stumbled upon the elusive fountain of youth. The smiles of her grandchildren, their innocent trust and reliance on her, filled her soul with energy. It was a type of happiness that you wish could last forever. But as we all know, life isn't always as perfect as it seems. Sometimes, even the sweetest joys come with an unexpected weight. One afternoon, while preparing dinner, Rosa overheard her daughter Lucia on the phone saying, "Mom is a blessing. I don't know what we'd do without her." Hearing those words sent a wave of pride through Rosa, but right behind that warmth, something else crept in, a small, nagging feeling she couldn't quite put her finger on. It was almost as if her joy was suddenly tinged with doubt. Was she as happy as she thought? Was there more to her life that she was missing? Epicurus once said, "It is not that we have little time, but that we waste a lot." Rosa couldn't help but wonder if she had been so focused on her role as a grandmother that she had let go of her desires and her own time. As the days turned into weeks and the weeks slipped into months, Rosa's routine became a quiet hum of responsibility. Breakfast with the kids, helping with homework, preparing lunches, and then doing it all again for dinner. There was comfort in the predictability of it all, but also a growing restlessness that tugged at the edges of her mind. She found herself thinking more often about her old apartment, the place where she once had the freedom to choose how her day would unfold, a place where she could sit in silence, sip coffee while reading a novel, or simply stare out the window, letting her thoughts wander. That kind of peace seemed like a distant memory now. Yet, Rosa couldn't help but scold herself for feeling this way. How can I be so ungrateful, she thought. I have everything I ever wanted. My family close, my grandchildren needing me, and a home filled with love. But deep down, a part of her yearned for something more. Something just for herself. A desire for autonomy. For a life that was more than just caregiving. It was a difficult realization for Rosa, one that felt almost like a betrayal of the happiness she had worked so hard to create for her family. And yet, it lingered, softly whispering to her as the days passed by. One Sunday morning, as the sweet smell of Mickey Mouse-shaped pancakes filled the kitchen, Rosa couldn't help but smile at the familiar routine. After all, what grandmother hasn't indulged their grandchildren's whims with fun-shaped breakfasts? But as she flipped the pancakes, something inside her stirred. She paused for a moment, realizing she couldn't remember the last time she had slept in or the last time she had gone out with friends without constantly watching the clock, worrying about getting back in time for dinner. It was a jarring thought, one that made her heart feel heavy. She had been so wrapped up in her role as a caregiver that she had slowly started losing herself in the process. Psychologist Erik Erikson talked about the importance of autonomy in old age, but Rosa was starting to feel like her autonomy was slipping away, wrapped up in layers of family love and silent, unspoken obligations. Her life was so intertwined with those of her children and grandchildren that her desires, her sense of independence, had started to fade into the background. That night, after tucking the kids into bed, Rosa found herself sitting alone on the porch, staring up at the stars. The night sky was vast and quiet, but her mind was anything but. She asked herself, is this really what I want for the rest of my life? The question seemed to hang in the cool night air, unanswered, like a balloon drifting further and further out of reach. The words of the poet Robert Frost came to her. Two roads diverged in a forest, and I took the one less traveled by. And in that moment, Rosa couldn't help but wonder, had she chosen the right path? In her quest to be the perfect grandmother, had she lost sight of her journey? Slowly, Rosa began to notice small but significant changes in her daily life. What had once been occasional visits to help with the grandchildren had morphed into a full-time responsibility. She was constantly changing diapers, preparing bottles, and chasing after energetic little ones. Does this sound familiar to you? You're not alone. Epicurus once said, "Time doesn't stand still, and neither does life." Rosa was beginning to feel the weight of those words more than ever. Time, it seemed, was slipping through her fingers. Her days, which had once included time for herself, whether to meet with friends, read, or simply relax, were now consumed by the unending demands of family life. And yet, remarkably, Rosa didn't complain. Like many grandmothers, she felt an unshakable sense of duty. This was her family, and she loved them deeply. But love, she was starting to realize, was not always enough to ward off the fatigue that was creeping in. With each passing day, an unnamed sense of loss began to settle over her. It was a quiet loss, not easily spoken of, but felt in every muscle and every tired sigh. This is where the term slave grandmother syndrome comes into play. No, it's not the title of a dramatic new Netflix series, though it very well could be. Coined by Dr. Antonio Guaro, this term describes the emotional and physical toll that grandmothers face when they take on unpaid caregiving roles. It's like being on an emotional roller coaster. On one hand, you love your grandchildren more than anything, and every smile, every thank you, Grandma, brings joy. But on the other hand, it feels like your life is slipping away one diaper change at a time. It's like trying to hug a cactus, beautiful in its way, but painful to hold. If you are still watching this video and find these lessons useful, please comment 1 below to let me know that you are still here with me. Studies show that this syndrome can have devastating effects on the mental health of grandmothers. The constant lack of recognition, the physical exhaustion, and the gradual erosion of personal freedom can lead to anxiety, depression, and even physical health issues. It's like running a marathon that never ends. You keep going, but there's no finish line, no medal waiting for you at the end to celebrate your effort. The weight of it all can be crushing. Rosa, like so many other grandmothers, found herself caught in this silent struggle. Her heart was full of love, but her spirit was growing tired. And though she didn't say it out loud, deep inside she was beginning to wonder, wasn't there more to life than this? Mrs. Rosa began to feel the weight of these symptoms slowly taking over her life. She grew increasingly tired, yet convinced herself that this was just part of being a grandmother. Wasn't it normal to feel exhausted after a day spent caring for her beloved grandchildren? She reasoned that it was. But deep down, she couldn't shake the growing sense that something was off. Is it normal to sacrifice your well-being for others? The harsh truth is, it's not. Psychologist Carol Gilligan speaks of the care ethic, particularly among women, who often place the needs of others ahead of their own without realizing the toll it takes. Mrs. Rosa was living this reality every day, giving up her time, her energy, and without even noticing, her happiness. As the days blurred together, Mrs. Rosa found herself gazing out the window more frequently, longing for the independence she used to cherish. She recalled simpler days when she could sip coffee with her friends, free of schedules or demands. Now, that kind of freedom seemed like a distant dream, a luxury she could no longer afford. Isn't it ironic? She had moved closer to her children in search of companionship and family closeness, but now she felt lonelier than ever before. It was as though the very family she loved so dearly was unintentionally building walls around her, shutting her into a life where her desires no longer mattered. As writer Paul, though so poignantly observed, loneliness begins with family. Perhaps he was right, after all. What started as a dream of family togetherness slowly morphed into a silent nightmare for Mrs. Rosa. The joy she once felt began to fade, replaced by an overwhelming sense of isolation and invisibility. Have you ever wondered how a decision made with so much love can lead us down an unexpected, painful path? This was the reality that Mrs. Rosa was grappling with. Her sacrifice, once filled with purpose, now felt suffocating. Then came the day when everything seemed to shift. As Mrs. Rosa stood in the kitchen, preparing lunch, her daughter Lucia entered with a frown. "Mom, how many times have I told you the kids don't like onions? Why do you keep putting them in everything?" Lucia's words fell on Mrs. Rosa like a bucket of ice-cold water. That sting of criticism cut deeper than expected. Not because of the onions, but because it revealed something far more unsettling. It wasn't just the onions. It was the way Rosa's choices, her voice, were slowly being disregarded. What started as small suggestions had turned into orders, and what used to be kind advice had turned into reproachful comments. Mrs. Rosa felt it deep in her bones. Her space was shrinking, her voice growing quieter. Bit by bit, she was losing herself. Does this sound familiar to you? Perhaps you've experienced this in your own life, or you've watched someone close to you struggle with the same silent battle. Psychologist Erik Erikson, known for his theory of psychosocial development, emphasized the importance of maintaining autonomy, especially in later years. According to Erikson, the loss of independence can lead to an identity crisis, leaving a person feeling lost, adrift, and hopeless. Mrs. Rosa, once full of life and purpose, was now grappling with these exact feelings. The freedom she once took for granted had slipped through her fingers, leaving her with a deep sense of loss. Isn't it ironic that in reaching out to the people we love for support, we sometimes risk losing something as precious as our very essence? Mrs. Rosa begins to feel the heavy weight of this reality, creeping up on her like a shadow. The vibrant days that were once filled with her projects, her dreams, and her passions have now been reduced to a repetitive cycle of taking care of her grandchildren and following a list of expectations she didn't create. Where was the woman who once dreamed of traveling the world, of learning new skills? That woman, full of life and ambition, now seems to fade, disappearing under the heavy cloak of other people's expectations. A study conducted by the University of Michigan revealed that older adults who maintain their independence report significantly higher levels of life satisfaction. That's incredible, right? But when we pause to consider how it feels to have every aspect of life controlled or dictated by someone else, it's easy to see how that satisfaction fades. Frustration starts to creep in, a feeling that Mrs. Rosa knows all too well. You should do it this way, or why don't you listen, becomes a tiny splinter lodged in her self-esteem, making her doubt her abilities and choices. Resentment, that uninvited but persistent guest, starts to settle in the home that once felt like her sanctuary. She doesn't speak of it, but inside, she can feel it growing. One night, after a particularly exhausting day, Mrs. Rosa retreats to her room. She sits on the edge of her bed, staring at the familiar walls that now seem to close in around her. Tears fall silently, and she feels something she hasn't said out loud, trapped worthless, like an old piece of furniture that no one cares for anymore, but that no one has the heart to throw away either. How many of our elders feel the same ache? How many live out this quiet drama in silence, their needs overshadowed by the unending demands of family? The paradox is cruel. Mrs. Rosa sought the warmth and closeness of family, but in doing so, she lost the fire of her own identity. What should have been a balm, a comfort in her older years, has instead become an invisible cage. The love she sought has, in some ways, become suffocating. But how does one escape this trap? Is it possible to regain independence without sacrificing family love? How can you rediscover who you are without losing the connections that mean the most to you? The philosopher Bertrand Russell once said, "The purpose of life is to grow, not just physically, but mentally and spiritually." But how could Mrs. Rosa ever grow if, every day, she feels herself becoming smaller, more diminished, within the walls of her own home? How could she rekindle her sense of self while fulfilling the unspoken demands of those she loves? The questions linger, unanswered but undeniable. Get ready to discover how a simple visit from a lifelong friend turned Mrs. Rosa's entire world upside down, offering her advice that challenged everything she thought she knew about aging, family, and what it means to live a fulfilling life. It was an ordinary day when Carmela, Mrs. Rosa's dear friend of many years, decided to surprise her with a visit. With her usual bright smile and a bag full of freshly baked cookies, Carmela rang the doorbell, fully expecting to see the lively, energetic Rosa she had known for decades. But what greeted her at the door left her speechless. "Rosa, is that you? You seem different," Carmela blurted out, taken aback by her friend's tired, worn appearance. The dark circles under Rosa's eyes and the forced smile that didn't quite reach her eyes were impossible to miss. Rosa, trying her best to cover up her exhaustion, waved Carmela inside, offering her a cup of coffee with that same strained smile. The warmth of their friendship lingered in the air, but Carmela couldn't help but notice how Rosa's usually immaculate house was now cluttered with toys, dishes, and the remnants of a life consumed by caregiving. "Rosa, is everything okay? You seem a little off," Carmela asked, her voice full of genuine concern. And with that question, the dam broke. Rosa had been holding it all in for so long, but now, like an overflowing river, the floodgates opened. She poured out her heart, letting years of exhaustion, frustration, and a deep sense of feeling trapped spill into the conversation. "You know, Carmela, sometimes I feel like I've lost my essence," Rosa said through tears. "I'm no longer Rosa. I'm just Grandma. I love my grandchildren. But where is the woman who once dreamed of seeing the world, who could lose herself in a novel until dawn? Now, I feel like I'm disappearing under the weight of everyone else's needs." Carmela listened quietly, nodding as her friend spoke, fully understanding the struggle. When Rosa had finally finished venting, Carmela gently took her hands and, with a soft but knowing smile, said, "Rosa, dear, what if I told you that I went through the same thing, and that I found a way out of it, a solution that completely changed my life?" Rosa's eyes widened with disbelief. "You? But you always seemed so happy, so free," she responded, unable to believe that Carmela had once felt the same crushing weight she now felt. Carmela let out a small laugh. "Oh, but it wasn't always like that," she replied. "Remember when my kids convinced me to move in with them? I thought it was the best decision at the time, but after 6 months, I realized I was losing myself. I was making the biggest mistake of my life. It took a lot of courage, but I knew I had to change something before it was too late. And so, in that small kitchen over coffee and cookies, a conversation unfolded that would change the course of Mrs. Rosa's life forever. What Carmela had to share would ignite something in Rosa: hope, determination, and the possibility of reclaiming her independence and identity without sacrificing the love she had for her family. If you are still watching this video and find these lessons useful, please comment too below to let me know that you are still here with me. And so, Carmela began to share her own story, her voice soft yet filled with conviction. Like Rosa, she had once felt the heavy burden of losing herself, her independence, her hobbies, her very essence buried beneath the weight of family expectations. But one day, Carmela continued, I had an epiphany. I remembered the words of philosopher Ralph Waldo Emerson. The only person you are destined to become is the person you decide to be. And I realized that the only way forward was to reclaim myself. I had to decide to be me again. Mrs. Rosa listened intently, captivated by her friend's words, hanging on to each sentence as though they were a lifeline. Carmela's journey mirrored her own, but what she heard next truly amazed her. Carmela had made the courageous decision to move into her own apartment, choosing to carve out a space for herself. It wasn't easy, Carmela admitted, her voice tinged with the memory of that challenge. At first, my children didn't understand. They were hurt and confused. They didn't know why I would want to leave. But over time, something remarkable happened. Our relationship began to flourish. They stopped seeing me as a burden or just a babysitter, and they started seeing me as their mother again, an independent, happy woman. Mrs. Rosa, wide-eyed, interrupted. Her curiosity piqued. But Carmela, she asked, don't you ever feel alone? Don't you miss having your family around all the time? Carmela smiled warmly, her expression filled with both wisdom and peace. Of course, I feel lonely sometimes. That's only natural. But as psychologist Carl Jung said, loneliness does not come from not having people around. It comes from the inability to communicate what's important to you. And let me tell you, Rosa, since I regained my independence, my conversations with my children and grandchildren have been richer, more meaningful. I'm not just fulfilling a role anymore. I'm sharing my life, my thoughts, and my joys. And that has made all the difference. Carmela's words struck a chord deep within Rosa, as though a veil had been lifted, revealing a path she had never even considered. This wasn't just about finding balance. It was about rediscovering the essence of herself. Could it be possible to find happiness without sacrificing her love for her family? True happiness, Carmela continued, her tone firm yet encouraging, comes from living on your terms, maintaining a healthy balance between your responsibilities to your family and your responsibilities to yourself. Did you know that studies have shown older adults who maintain their independence enjoy better mental and physical health? Rosa, still absorbing this new perspective, shook her head in surprise. I didn't know that, she admitted. Well, it's true, Carmela replied. A study published in the Journal of Gerontology found that older adults who live independently report higher levels of life satisfaction, and they even have stronger immune systems. Plus, they experience lower rates of depression. And Rosa, we deserve that, don't we? Mrs. Rosa sat in thoughtful silence for a moment, the weight of Carmela's words sinking in. A mixture of fear and excitement swirled in her chest. Could she make such a change? Could she step away without hurting the people she loved most? Finally, with a trembling voice but a spark of hope in her heart, she asked, But Carmela, how do I start? I'm afraid. I'm afraid of hurting my daughter, my grandchildren. Before we dive further into the story, if you're enjoying this video, make sure to hit the like button and subscribe with the bell so you don't miss out on future videos. I absolutely love sharing these kinds of heartfelt stories, and I hope they resonate with you too. If they do, leave a comment below saying, I love these stories. And tell me what you'd like to see next. I read all of your comments, and together, we can keep learning and improving our lives. Now, let's get back to Mrs. Rose's journey and see how she finds the courage to take the first step toward rediscovering herself. Carmela gave Rosa's hand a gentle, loving squeeze, her eyes full of warmth. "Rosa, dear, true love is not possessive. Your children will love you more when they see how happy you are being yourself." The words hung in the air, heavy with truth yet light with possibility. Rosa had never considered it that way before. Her love for her family had been so all-encompassing that she had forgotten about the importance of loving herself too. Carmela's voice was soothing yet firm as she continued. "Start small. You don't have to change everything overnight. Take up that painting course you've always dreamed of, or go for a peaceful walk in the mornings. Little by little, reclaim your space, your time, your life." And with those simple words, something shifted in Rosa. The quiet hope she had buried deep inside began to stir. Sitting with a cold cup of coffee in her hands, Rosa suddenly felt the warm glow of new possibilities filling her heart. Carmela's unexpected visit hadn't just brought cookies. It had brought the seed of a new beginning. As Rosa sat there, she realized that she was standing at an emotional crossroads. On one hand, her love for her family was boundless, but on the other, she felt like she was disappearing, fading into a version of herself that she no longer recognized. She had given so much of herself to others that she had forgotten who she was. It was then that she recalled the wise words of the philosopher Seneca. "Life is long if you know how to use it." The phrase echoed in her mind. Had she truly been using her life, or was she simply going through the motions, existing for others but not for herself? The question lingered as she considered the woman she once was, full of dreams and passions. One morning, while making Mickey Mouse-shaped pancakes for her grandchildren, just as she had done countless times, Rosa had an epiphany. She remembered her long-abandoned passion for painting. It had been years since she'd held a paintbrush, and the thought both excited and scared her. When had she last lost herself in the colors and strokes of a canvas? She couldn't remember, and the realization hit her hard. That very day, Rosa decided to take her first small step toward independence. It wasn't anything monumental, just a solitary walk in the park, but it felt significant. At first, guilt tugged at her, reminding her that she could be home helping out. But as she walked, she discovered that this hour of solitude was like an oasis in a desert of constant demands. For the first time in what felt like ages, she could hear her thoughts breathe freely and simply exist without being needed by anyone. As these walks became a regular part of her routine, Rosa found herself reflecting on her forgotten dreams. She began to see a vision of her life that wasn't solely focused on caregiving, but on rediscovering the woman she had once been. She wondered what had become of the person who had wanted to travel, learn new things, and pursue her passions. Slowly, her resolve strengthened. Her next step was even bolder. She signed up for a painting workshop for seniors at the local community center. "Oh my God," she thought nervously. "What if I've forgotten how to paint? What if I don't even enjoy it anymore?" Fear gripped her for a moment, but she pushed it aside, remembering the words of the great painter Pablo Picasso. "Inspiration exists, but it has to find you working." And so, Rosa showed up to that first class, unsure of what to expect. To her delight, the moment she picked up the brush and dipped it into the paint, something inside her came alive again. It was as if the part of her that had been dormant for so long had finally woken up. With every stroke of the brush, Rosa felt the years melt away. She had rediscovered not only her love for art, but also a piece of herself she thought had been lost forever. In the workshop, Mrs. Rosa not only rediscovered her love for art, but also found herself in the company of new friends. People who, like her, were embracing their journey toward independence and self-expression. Between the colorful brushstrokes and the warm sound of laughter filling the room, she realized something profound. For so long, she had been living on autopilot, simply moving through the motions of life without truly living. It became clear to her that life, at any age, is full of possibilities, something she had forgotten while consumed by family responsibilities. It was not just about finding joy in art again. It was about reclaiming her own identity. A study from Harvard University revealed that maintaining independence in old age not only improves mental health, but can also increase life expectancy by up to 5 years. Mrs. Rosa, with her newfound purpose, was a living proof of this. With every personal decision she made, she felt a sense of rejuvenation, as if the weight of years had lifted from her shoulders. However, not every day was filled with sunshine. There were moments when guilt washed over her like a tidal wave. Am I being selfish? She would wonder as she indulged in her pursuits or spent time away from her family. But then Carmela's wise words would echo in her mind. You can't pour from an empty cup. Taking care of herself was not an act of selfishness. It was essential if she wanted to continue caring for those she loved. Mrs. Rosa slowly came to understand that self-care wasn't indulgent. It was necessary. As she embraced her independence, she began to notice remarkable changes in herself. Her energy returned, no longer drained by the constant weight of caregiving. Her chronic aches and pains, which had once seemed permanent, started to fade. Even her memory, once foggy and unreliable, sharpened. Dr. Oliver Sacks, the brilliant neurologist and writer, once said, "The brain is the most incredible organ. It adapts, transforms, and remodels itself with each new experience." Mrs. Rosa was living proof of this transformation. With every new adventure, with every risk she took, her brain and her life were reshaping in ways she hadn't thought possible. If you are still watching this video and find these lessons useful, please comment 3 below to let me know that you are still here with me. But perhaps the most unexpected change was in her relationship with her family. In a paradox she never would have anticipated, the less time she spent physically with them, the more meaningful their time together became. The moments shared with her children and grandchildren weren't filled with the exhausted complaints of a tired grandmother, but with vibrant stories and laughter. She was no longer the weary caregiver, but a woman with fascinating experiences and insights to share. Despite all these positive changes, Mrs. Rosa knew there was one more hurdle she had to overcome, a conversation she had been avoiding but could no longer postpone. As poet Maya Angelou wisely said, "There is no greater agony than carrying an untold story inside you." Mrs. Rosa had a story to tell, and she could no longer keep it inside. It was time to talk to her daughter, Lucia. Her heart pounded in her chest as she prepared for the conversation. She knew it wouldn't be easy, but it was necessary. With her hands trembling and her mind racing, she sat down across from Lucia, who looked at her with a curious, puzzled expression. "Lucia, darling," she began, her voice quivering with emotion. "We have to talk." Lucia tilted her head slightly, sensing the seriousness in her mother's tone. She had no idea what was coming, but her curiosity was piqued. Mrs. Rosa took a deep breath, steadying herself. "I've been thinking a lot lately," she continued, "and I've realized something important. I think it's time for me to move into my place." The words, once so heavy in her heart, now hung in the air between them, full of possibility. It was the beginning of a new chapter, one that Mrs. Rosa hadn't even realized she was ready to write. The silence that followed Mrs. Rosa's words was almost unbearable, heavy with emotions that neither mother nor daughter had expected. Lucia blinked, her mind racing as she tried to absorb what her mother had just said. "But Mom," Lucia stammered, her voice trembling slightly. "Aren't you comfortable here? Did we do something wrong?" The concern and worry in her voice were unmistakable, laced with a hint of guilt that tugged at Mrs. Rosa's heart. Mrs. Rosa smiled gently, her eyes soft with understanding. "No, my love," she reassured her daughter. "You've all been wonderful. You've given me so much love, and I've cherished every moment. But I need to rediscover myself, to have my own space." She thought of the words of Jean-Paul Sartre, "The human being is condemned to be free." And here she was at 70 years old, choosing that freedom. The thought both frightened and thrilled her. Lucia's expression shifted from shock to confusion. Her brow furrowed as she processed the weight of her mother's decision. Sadness crept into her eyes, mingling with a growing understanding. But, Mom, will you be okay? What if you get sick? Lucia's voice was thick with worry, and it was clear she was struggling to reconcile her desire to protect her mother with her mother's need for independence. Mrs. Rosa took Lucia's hands in hers, giving them a comforting squeeze. "Lucia, I'm not disappearing," she said, her voice gentle but firm. "I'll always be here for you, but I need my own space to grow and enjoy this stage of my life. I read about how older adults who maintain their independence tend to be happier and healthier. It's not about leaving, it's about flourishing." Lucia bit her lip, searching for another reason to hold on. "But what about the children? They love having you here, and we do too," she said, her voice softening as she clung to the last shred of resistance. Mrs. Rosa smiled, her eyes twinkling. "And I love being with them, but you know what? I think I'll be an even better grandmother if I have time to myself. Remember what Immoral Limburg said? The most exquisite of human pleasures is to be loved, but to be loved freely, with will. I want to love you all freely, not out of obligation." For a moment, Lucia was silent, her gaze falling to the floor as she wrestled with her emotions. But when she looked back up, tears welled in her eyes. She nodded slowly, the understanding finally settling in. "You're right, Mom. We're going to miss you so much." "And I'll miss you too," Mrs. Rosa said, pulling Lucia into a warm embrace. "But just think of all the delicious meals I'll cook when you visit me, and no one will tell me I'm using too much salt." The two women laughed, breaking the tension and allowing the relief to flood in. It was a conversation that had been brewing for some time, but now that it was out in the open, both mother and daughter felt a sense of peace. Family psychologist Dr. Maria Elena Rodriguez often speaks about how these difficult conversations are vital for maintaining healthy relationships between parents and adult children. She emphasizes that open, honest communication, even when it leads to significant changes, can strengthen family bonds, allowing everyone to grow in the process. As they sat together, mother and daughter, there was a newfound understanding between them, an unspoken recognition that this decision, while difficult, was a step toward an even deeper connection, built on love, respect, and the freedom to be truly oneself. As the conversation unfolded, Lucia began to understand her mother's point of view. The weight of Mrs. Rosa's words sank in, and Lucia found herself reflecting on how much space each person needs, even within the confines of a loving family. "I guess we all need our space," Lucia admitted, her voice tinged with acceptance. "And you've spent so many years taking care of us." Mrs. Rosa nodded, her heart swelling with gratitude for her daughter's growing understanding. "Exactly, my love. And now it's time for me to take care of myself." She smiled gently, the wisdom of age radiating from her as she recalled the words of the poet Rumi. "Yesterday I was smart, so I wanted to change the world. Today I am wise, so I am changing myself." Lucia couldn't help but smile back, a blend of pride and nostalgia sparkling in her eyes. "Well, Mom, I guess we'll just have to help you find the perfect apartment. One with a kitchen big enough for all your secret recipes, and of course, a balcony for my plants," she added with a chuckle. Mrs. Rosa's face lit up at the thought, excitement bubbling up inside her. The day Mrs. Rosa crossed the threshold into her new apartment was filled with mixed emotions. There was excitement, but also nervousness. Am I doing the right thing, she wondered, her heart racing with the unknown. But then she remembered the words of psychologist Carl Jung. "I am not what has happened to me. I am what I choose to become." And in that moment, Mrs. Rosa knew she was choosing bravery, choosing herself. The process of decorating her new home became an unexpected form of therapy. Each object she carefully placed was a quiet affirmation of her identity. The colorful rug she had always adored but her daughter found too loud, the paintings of her favorite artist that now brightened her walls. She even dared to paint a wall of bold, vibrant turquoise. Laughing to herself, she thought, "Oh, if my Ramon could see me now." Her late husband would have loved the new spark of freedom she had ignited in herself. But it wasn't just about decorating. It was about truly stepping out of her comfort zone. One of her first steps was signing up for a gardening workshop at the community center. Plants and grandmothers, how cliché, she mused to herself. But something about it felt right. And that's when she met Mrs. Consuelo, a widow with a sharp sense of humor and a spirit of adventure. The two became fast friends, finding joy in exploring new things together. Through Consuelo, Mrs. Rosa discovered the concept of active aging, an idea that aging is not about merely existing, but about living with purpose. The World Health Organization notes that active aging allows people to reach their full potential for physical, social, and mental well-being at every stage of life. For Mrs. Rosa, this newfound purpose was her rebirth. Together, she and Mrs. Consuelo took on challenges they would have never imagined, like yoga classes. The first session, a complete disaster. "I felt like a bad pretzel," Mrs. Rosa joked, but they persisted, and soon enough, they noticed improvements in their flexibility and balance. But even more important than their progress was the laughter, the kind that left them breathless, as if they were young again. One day, while sharing coffee after class, Mrs. Consuelo turned to Rosa with a smile and said, "Have you noticed we don't complain about our aches and pains anymore?" Mrs. Rosa laughed, realizing it was true. They had become so busy living that they had forgotten about the worries that come with getting older. The words of the Roman philosopher Seneca rang in her ears. Life is like a play. It does not matter how long it lasted, but how well it was performed. Mrs. Rosa was determined that her second act would be the most vibrant and meaningful. And so, she dared even more. She joined a book club, rediscovering her love of poetry, and even taking the leap to write her verses, something she hadn't done since she was a young woman. "The wrinkles on the paper are less noticeable than on my face," she joked to her new friends, embracing the joy of creation. If you are still watching this video and find these lessons useful, please comment below to let me know that you are still here with me. The most profound transformation, however, was in her relationship with her family. Paradoxically, by giving herself space, the time she spent with her children and grandchildren became more cherished. Their visits were no longer an obligation weighed down by expectations, but moments of shared joy. One Sunday, while her eldest granddaughter helped her water the plants on the small balcony, Mrs. Rosa had a quiet revelation. Not only had she regained her independence, but she had also given a gift to the younger generations. The lesson that aging can be filled with dignity, joy, and adventure. In her newfound freedom, Mrs. Rosa wasn't just living her life. She was teaching by example that life doesn't have to narrow with age. It can expand in ways no one expects. And that, perhaps, was the greatest legacy she could ever leave behind. The paradox of love is one of life's quiet yet profound truths. Sometimes, it's distance that strengthens the deepest connections. When Mrs. Rosa made the bold decision to move into her apartment, many around her thought she was making a mistake. "How are you going to live alone at your age?" they asked with concern. But Rosa, with a playful glint in her eye, responded, "Alone? Now I have more of a social life than an influencer." And much to their surprise, she wasn't exaggerating. The physical distance that now separated her from her family acted like an elastic band. It stretched, but instead of weakening their bond, it strengthened it. Visits from her grandchildren, once routine and somewhat obligatory, became special adventures eagerly anticipated by all. They were no longer just afternoons spent in front of the TV, but lively expeditions full of laughter, stories, and creativity. One such day, her grandchildren arrived to find Mrs. Rosa standing in front of a giant canvas, paintbrush in hand and splatters of color decorating her face. "Grandma, you look like Picasso," Lil Matto exclaimed with delight. Mrs. Rosa, with paint even on her eyebrows, laughed and responded, "What's wrong with that? Picasso is too small for me. I am the great Rosa." That afternoon, between joyful strokes of the brush and shared giggles, they created a family masterpiece that would hang proudly in her living room for years to come, a testament to their bond and shared love of art. But it wasn't just the visits that changed. The once short and routine phone calls between Mrs. Rosa and her family transformed into longer, deeper conversations. As psychologist Carl Rogers would say, the good communicator listens not only with his ears but with his eyes and heart. This was what Mrs. Rosa and her family experienced. They began to listen to one another, and the emotional intimacy between them grew stronger than ever. Mrs. Rosa's decision to reclaim her independence had an unexpected ripple effect on her entire family. Lucia, her daughter, one day confessed, "Seeing Mom so independent and happy has inspired me to return to my dreams." Rosa's brave leap into autonomy wasn't just about her. It was sowing seeds of change in everyone she loved. The freedom and joy she radiated were contagious, inspiring her family to reconsider their own lives and aspirations. A study conducted by the University of Michigan revealed that older adults who maintain their independence report significantly higher levels of life satisfaction and enjoy better relationships with their family members. Mrs. Rosa was living, breathing proof of this. Her experience was a direct challenge to the stereotypes about aging, that it must be a time of dependency and decline. She was showing, through her actions, that growing older can be filled with vitality, joy, and growth. One afternoon, while sipping coffee with friends, Mrs. Rosa reflected on the lessons she had learned. "You know," she mused, "before all of this, I thought love meant being together all the time. But now, I understand that true love needs room to grow." Her words echoed the wisdom of poet Khalil Gibran, who once wrote, "Leave space in your union." The paradox of love that Mrs. Rosa had discovered was simple yet profound. Sometimes, moving away is exactly what we need to get closer to those we love. By giving herself the freedom to grow, she had nurtured the relationships that mattered most, allowing them to bloom in ways she had never imagined. As philosopher Eric from Wisely observed, mature love says, "I need you because I love you." Mrs. Rose embodied this understanding as she transitioned from a state of suffocating dependence to a healthier, more balanced, interdependent love. Her newfound independence not only transformed her life, but also deeply impacted her family. The grandchildren now had two loving homes where they felt nurtured. Her children experienced less pressure and more gratitude. And Mrs. Rose herself was flourishing in ways she hadn't anticipated. It was as though they had collectively discovered the secret recipe for a happy, harmonious family. And the key ingredient, paradoxically, was a little distance. What Mrs. Rosa came to understand was that the balance wasn't about completely living with her children or isolating herself entirely. It lay somewhere in the middle. As the Greek philosopher Aristotle famously said, "Virtue lies in the middle." And Mrs. Rosa, with her newfound clarity, saw this truth firsthand. After her epiphany, where she made the brave decision to reclaim her independence, she encountered a new challenge: how to maintain a close, loving relationship with her family without sacrificing her hard-won freedom. The answer, as with many of life's profound truths, was simple yet far from easy: balance. Mrs. Rosa discovered that the essence of this balance was healthy interdependence, a concept American psychologist Stephen Covey describes as the harmonious blend of independence and dependence. For Mrs. Rosa, this meant setting clear but flexible boundaries that respected both her needs and her family's. She agreed, for instance, to babysit her grandchildren 2 afternoons a week, ensuring cherished time with them, but reserved the rest of the week for her activities and personal growth. "It's like juggling," she would often joke. "But instead of balls, I'm balancing love, freedom, and responsibility." This new approach had a profound and unexpected effect on her relationship with her family. The time they spent together was no longer routine or draining, but filled with laughter, meaning, and genuine connection. Every moment they shared became more intentional, more special. Mrs. Rosa realized that it wasn't the number of hours they spent together that strengthened their bond, but the quality of those moments. As the writer Mitch Albom aptly put it, "Death ends a life, not a relationship." Mrs. Rose embraced this idea, understanding that the depth of her relationships with her loved ones was rooted in the joy, love, and understanding they shared, not in how much time they spent together. In balancing love, freedom, and family, Mrs. Rosa had truly found her place, one where she could flourish as both an individual and a cherished member of her family. But the path to Mrs. Rosa's newfound independence was not without its share of challenges. There were days when guilt crept back into her heart, casting a shadow over her sunny sense of freedom. It was as though a dark cloud had appeared on an otherwise bright day, threatening to unravel the progress she had made. In those moments, Mrs. Rosa would pause and remind herself of the words of psychologist Carl Jung. What you deny subjugates you. What you accept transforms you. Rather than pushing away the guilt or pretending it didn't exist, she chose to acknowledge it. By accepting her feelings, she used them as opportunities to reaffirm her decision to put herself first, knowing that her well-being was as important as her love for her family. Studies back up Mrs. Rosa's experience. Research from the University of Michigan found that older adults who manage to strike a balance between independence and family support are 30% less likely to suffer from depression. Mrs. Rosa became living proof of this. Her life is now a testament to the fact that maintaining that balance led to not only greater happiness, but also improved health. As time passed, Mrs. Rosa became something of a mentor among her peers at the senior support group she attended. Her story was shared not with pride, but with humor and wisdom. "My dears," she would say, "old age is like a fine wine. It needs space to breathe, but it also needs the warmth of good company to bring out its full flavor." Her words resonated with her friends, encouraging many to rethink their family dynamics and how they approached aging with dignity and independence. As anthropologist Margaret Mead once famously said, "Never doubt that a small group of thoughtful, committed citizens can change the world. Indeed, it's the only thing that ever has." In her way, Mrs. Rosa was changing her world, one family at a time. Her story inspired not only her friends but her entire family, shifting perspectives on aging, independence, and love. Yet, perhaps the most significant transformation was within Mrs. Rosa herself. She no longer saw herself as merely a figurehead in her family or, worse, a burden. Now, she was a woman with purpose, dreams, and the energy to pursue them. The philosopher Seneca's words echoed in her heart. "It's not that we have little time, but that we lose a lot." And Mrs. Rosa had made up her mind. She wasn't going to lose another moment to self-doubt or societal expectations. Her story offers a powerful reminder that an act of self-love can transform not just an individual, but an entire family. When Mrs. Rosa chose to regain her independence, it wasn't just a personal victory. It was a seed of wisdom planted within her family. Psychologist Carl Jung's belief that the greatest impact we can have on our children is not to teach them, but to live our own lives fully had come to life in her journey. Mrs. Rosa wasn't merely telling her family how to live. She was showing them, through her actions, what it meant to live fully. Her courage to reclaim her life had a profound ripple effect. Lucia, who had once been hesitant and unsure about her mother's decision, began to see her in a new light. Mrs. Rosa was no longer just grandma. She was a woman with dreams, ambitions, and passions of her own. Inspired by her mother's transformation, Lucia began to re-examine her own life, asking herself whether she was truly living according to her desires or merely following the well-worn path of duty and routine. If you are still watching this video and find these lessons useful, please comment 5 below to let me know that you are still here with me. The grandchildren, too, were profoundly impacted. Visits to their grandmother's house were no longer just about being spoiled with treats and hugs. Now, they looked forward to hearing her fascinating stories, seeing her vibrant new paintings, and learning about her adventures in the art studio. Their eyes sparkled with admiration as they absorbed the lesson Mrs. Rosa unknowingly imparted, that life doesn't stop with age, and independence is not something to be feared but embraced. They learned that growing older can mean growing wiser, braver, and more full of life than ever before. In her own quiet and powerful way, Mrs. Rosa was showing her family and everyone around her that life is what you make of it at any stage. But Mrs. Rose's legacy stretches far beyond the walls of her own home or the embrace of her immediate family. Her journey beckons each of us to take a closer look at our family dynamics. Are we truly respecting the personal space and autonomy of those we love, or are we unintentionally stifling them with our well-meaning expectations? Her story asks us to consider, do we encourage freedom, or do we, without realizing it, hold our loved ones back in the name of closeness? The philosopher Khalil Gibran captured this paradox beautifully when he wrote, "Your children are not your children. They are the sons and daughters of life's longing for itself." Mrs. Rosa came to understand that this wisdom applies not only to children, but also to parents. We are not bound by the expectations of others. We are individuals with lives of our own, deserving of space to breathe, to grow, and to rediscover ourselves at every stage of life. So, dear viewer, I turn this reflection toward you. I invite you to pause and ask yourself, are you living your life or the life that others expect of you? It's never too late to take a step back and reclaim the dreams you may have set aside. If you've ever wanted to take that long dream motorcycle trip, then why not go for it? And please, don't forget to invite me along, huh? Life is far too short to let fear keep us in our comfort zones. The greatest lessons often come from doing things that scare us, and through those experiences, we grow and evolve. As the great Goethe once said, whatever you can do, or dream you can do, start it. Boldness has genius, power, and magic in it. So I encourage you to be bold, fearless, and most importantly, be yourself. The best gift you can give to your family and yourself is your happiness. Embrace the adventure of living life fully on your terms. As we come to the end of Mrs. Rose's inspiring journey, I want to ask you, what have you learned so far? How has her story of rediscovering independence and embracing life's adventures touched you? Please take a moment to reflect and share one thing you've learned from her story that you'll bring into practice in your own life. Whether it's giving yourself the freedom to follow your dreams, respecting the personal space of those you love, or simply daring to step out of your comfort zone. I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. If you enjoyed this video, please leave your comment and don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to our YouTube channel. By doing so, you'll stay connected with more inspiring stories and valuable insights that can enrich your life and the lives of those around you. Thanks for watching, and until next time, be bold, be yourself, and keep growing.